Hello, my name's Jeff Young, and I'm an e-spec author, and today's story is a steampunk story. And this is part of the Cassandra Leyden adventures, and this is Cassandra Leyden adventure number 2. Cassandra has realized by now that she's different from everyone else, and she has the ability to speak to the dead, but she doesn't really understand how to use that ability yet. So her father creates an apprenticeship for her with one of the mediums that is local in the area. And this is how she learns to speak to the dead. This is called Beyond the Familiar. The departed have better things to do than talk to you. Cassandra met that statement from Madame Foss with a canted eyebrow. Look at me like that all you want, girl, but it is still the truth. The old medium tipped her teacup back and drank down the last dregs as Cassandra waited for her to continue. It may sound absurd, but the dead don't always have an interest in the price of butter. They have moved on. They've joined the grand choir. They've earned their reward. They have other concerns. Cassandra couldn't help but notice as Madame Foss delivered her last comment, her eyes drifted off to the right, and she lifted the cup for another sip, only to find she'd already emptied it. Cassandra enjoyed her time with her new mentor, surrounded by the scents of old book leather and candle wax, which made her feel at home. However, she often found that Madame Foss avoided was as important as what she relayed. Cassandra's father was the one who'd set up this apprenticeship, rather to her amazement. He told her that despite whatever he felt, it appeared she was taking after her mother's spiritual prowess, that the least he could do was introduce her to someone who could keep her safe. Because it was expected of her, she asked, "Well, Madame Foss, how does one engage with the departed? My former teacher had rather poor taste in robbing graves and then forced the spirits to speak." Madame Foss's dark, wrinkled visage puckered up even further, as if she'd been offered something scraped off the road outside. "You and I will be avoiding such wrongdoing. Whatever we do is like a tool. We could build a house with it or lash about and do all sorts of damage. And such behavior has the potential not only of hurting others, but also of yourself." And with that, one of her brown fingers shot out and dug into Cassandra's chest. "You will do better than that, wretch." Leaning away, seemingly so she could reach for her tea while conveniently putting herself out of range of that finger, Cassandra considered her mentor. Madame Foss kept her hand outstretched for a moment longer, and then settled back into her chair. "We speak to the dead through intermediaries. There are those that are as restless in death as they were in life. They can find the spirits we need to speak to, and if those are unwilling to speak, the intermediaries can carry messages." "They're familiars," Cassandra said, suddenly pleased with herself at the realization. The chair creaked as Madame Foss lunged forward once again, finger pointed, and then thought better of the action. She clutched her hands together, staring at Cassandra. "I keep forgetting how much older than most of the ones who were brought to me you are." She shook her head, the gray curls swaying under her bonnet. "You like to think yourself of listening like a youngster would. Girl, if you say familiar to anyone else, they'll be crying witchcraft in no time at all. What we do has nothing to do with the darkness that we were discussing before. Perhaps some spirits do become familiar, and perhaps that's why they take such a name. But the common man knows the term only as evil. We speak to intermediaries, and to intermediaries only. We are mediums. The dead speak to us, and we speak for them. That's all that matters. And when someone decides they know better than we do, that's when the words evil and witch get tossed about. And that's when they start getting tender." She considered Cassandra for a moment longer, her dark eyes squinting as though she could see inside of her charge. And then the passage of a dirigible droning by overhead broke her focus. She stood up suddenly and gestured for Cassandra to follow her. Setting aside her teacup, Cassandra brushed the front of her brown dress down and then stepped after her mentor as she crossed the sitting room and walked through the foyer. A large staircase rose into the dimness of the upper level, dividing the house. Past it were a pair of large wooden doors. Cassandra had spent most of her time in the sitting room and the kitchen during her visits. They hadn't ventured beyond that until now. Madame Foss pulled out a large brass key and unlocked the doors, and then threw them wide. Dark curtains covered the windows in what appeared to be a converted dining room. Wooden chairs with caned bottoms had been spread around the perimeter, and a rich rug covered the floor. But what drew Cassandra's attention was the table at the center. It was circular and draped in deep velvet. A wooden disc lay on top, only slightly smaller in diameter, and at its center was a hole through which were braided copper wires rising from the inside to latch onto a Jacob's ladder that climbed halfway to the ceiling. Copper threads chased around the wooden circle in strange patterns, and two brass hand grips were mounted close enough for easy use. A leather-backed chair was pushed up to the table in front of the grips. Madame Voss pulled back the chair and said to Cassandra, "Sit." Before they'd been merely conversing, and the tone that the medium took now was one that Cassandra dropped immediately into the chair before her without even considering rebelling. Instinctively, she reached for the grips. They were cold to her touch, that she almost pulled away, but a sharp glance from Madame Voss made her keep her hands in place. The older woman reached down and turned a large crank that was just visible under the edge of the tablecloth, and as she did so, a crackle snapped through the air, and a flicker of static flew up the Jacob's ladder, and then another, until visible arcs ascended upward and dissipated into the surrounding air. The copper wiring on the table danced with fat blue sparks under the current, until it hit Cassandra, shooting her hair out in all directions. Her red curls unfurled like a corona about her. "Now you know why I wear a bonnet," came Madame Voss's dry comment. But Cassandra scarcely paid any attention at all to the comment. Her skin, her pores, her mouth, her eyes, her ears, every exit from her wept thin, translucent streams. Not water, ectoplasm. Madame Voss had called it the insulation between the worlds at one point. And there it was, real as real could be, right before Cassandra. Gradually, the silvery substance collected into a sphere over the table. And when Cassandra looked down at the design in copper with its circles about the hand grips, she realized that it was designed to help keep the ectoplasm contained. The Jacob's ladder overhead blew off just the right amount of static to keep the circuit she completed safe. More and more ectoplasm poured from her until the sphere swelled to twice the size of her head. She looked at it closely and discovered that it was spinning, ever so slightly. And instinctively, she lunged forward out of the chair and, without a thought to Madame Voss's concerns, plunged her head into the silver mass. At first, she didn't notice anything. It was almost as if her eyes were adjusting to a dark room. She definitely wasn't sitting at the table any longer. But there came a faint sound that might actually be footsteps, and a light breeze blew across her face. And gradually, she realized she was looking down what she could only describe as a path. It was so straight and long that perspective vanished in the distance. She could see a little of what looked like woods to either side, but couldn't actually move her point of view. It was as if her head wasn't with her any longer, only her eyes. There were shapes and shadows ahead of her. However, they were so far down the path they were more like suggestions or imperfections in the overall pattern. And then one of the shadows stepped off to the side and grew darker and became more defined. It stepped onto the path and crossed it quickly. Briefly, it hesitated. For the tiniest part of an instant, Cassandra had the impression of a dark, cloaked form turning to stare at her before it faded into the other side. The last time Cassandra had seen the shade of her mother, Anastasia, she'd worn a dark cloak, and if there was any spirit she wished to speak to now, it was certainly her. If Mother were to become her familiar spirit, pardon her intermediary, it would be almost perfect. But the figure was gone, and the path faded as Madame Voss's iron grip pulled her forcibly back into the chair and thus the mortal realm. As Cassandra sat there gasping, her hands torn from the brass grips, Madame Voss considered her, hands akimbo. "Should have known you were going to do that. And from now on, you headstrong girl, you listen to me. You plan on staying on. The other side doesn't take kindly to intruders. There are things that keep us out. That's the important part. We talk to the other side. You don't get to visit unless you are planning on staying. Now you just sit back and I'll get you another cup of tea. Your heart's going to race and be all out of rhythm for a while, and it's likely you'll have trouble catching your breath. You're young, so you'll do fine, but it'll hurt." And with that, she reached underneath and pulled the handle she'd cranked into place against the underside of the table. And as the apparatus threw out a few spray sparks, she patted Cassandra on the shoulder and wandered off after tea. While Cassandra sat there, blinking, black spots chased across her vision as her heart thumped away like a swallow trapped in a chimney. She knew she would have a few moments to herself before Madame Foss fiddled away with the new auto brewer that she had bought to make her tea, and her mind was racing. Cassandra had seen what she could dare say was heaven. Well, she'd seen the other side anyway. It wasn't anything like what she'd expected. In the weeks that followed, Cassandra continued to take a carriage across town from her father's home to call on Madame Foss. Their relationship, however, had definitely changed. In short, Cassandra's task was to observe everything. And while she hadn't been invited to sit at the table again, she found herself introduced as Madame Foss's assistant and was called upon to help the medium with her clientele. She took coats, made tea, and seated herself demurely behind Madame Foss while the woman asked questions of the departed. She noted that Madame Foss did the talking. The strange apparitions which appeared over the table had no voices. It didn't take her long to realize that Madame Foss was in fact reading the lips of her spirit guests. Cassandra soon began to learn the art herself. One morning, she'd stolen into the sitting room to discover that her mentor had been looking at during their initial meeting. The bookshelf across from where she'd sat had a conspicuously empty spot, and reaching into the void, she found a small daguerreotype image. In the scratchy image was a small ebony-faced child with deep brows and a long nose, who held a cicada in their hands. The likeness reminded her of Madame Foss, and the black curly hair could easily have turned gray. Cassandra carefully replaced the picture, brushing the dust back into place. 2 days later, while Madame Foss was cursing at her auto brewer, Cassandra slipped into the table room. She noticed that all of the chairs in the working room, as Madame Foss called it, were attached to the floor. Various knickknacks were affixed to surfaces that they rested upon. She felt the odd lightness produced by opening the way with ectoplasm and imagined things might become chaotic if not controlled. She'd taken an unsupervised moment to examine the table further and found the name Emmett Ressex engraved on the wooden panel where the crank fitted in. Cassandra had heard of his reputation as a spiritualist and an artificer. And after watching several sessions, it became obvious to Cassandra that when she'd sat at the table the first time, she'd merely begun the process of contacting the other side. Once Madame Foss had the requisite amount of ectoplasm collected, she would call out seeking an intermediary. Someone she often referred to as Jasper would answer her. A caricature of a vaguely familiar face would then form in the surface of the ectoplasmic sphere. His answers were given by the motion of his lips without evidence of any sound. Madame Foss's intermediary appeared well informed. After a short wait, he told an elderly man that his wife had sold off her jewels before she passed away and where she hid the money. Another was informed that the property line that he believed was incorrectly drawn was actually accurate. However, there was no way to prove it. A loved one was assured that their lost child was happy. A woman in black was told that her husband was in fact not dead but had run away. Cassandra found herself admiring Madame Foss's ability to deal with all of these pronouncements. As far as Cassandra could tell, Madame Foss hadn't lied to any of them. She hadn't made them all happy either, but in the end they had all paid her. Cassandra watched them as they left and noticed something different about each one. Something was lighter in their step. There was an absence of tension in their expressions, or less of a slump in their shoulders. In each case, the person who passed beyond or had run off left their supplicant with a need for closure, and Madame Foss had given them that. It didn't matter whether or not they left in a carriage, steam-powered auto, or simply walked. Each left as though a weight was lifted from them. It occurred to Cassandra that this ability was one that she admired. As much as she watched and learned, it wasn't enough. She desperately wanted to call for the ectoplasm once again and seek out the dark-cloaked figure that she'd seen in the way between the worlds of the living and the dead. And the recurring image in her imagination made her want to try something reckless, and only Madame Foss had shown herself to be very observant, and Cassandra was certain she would know if her student had used the table. One afternoon, after a long session with an attorney seeking information about one of his less savory clients, Madame Foss had sighed heavily and put a hand to her forehead. I feel a fever coming on. Child, can you make me a cup of tea? I believe perhaps I should rest for the remainder of the day. Cassandra did as her mentor asked, choosing the chamomile in the hope that it might make Madame Foss feel better. And after a few sips, the old woman leaned back in her chair with a sigh. I don't think I'm up to dealing with the remaining appointments I have today. Can you be a dear and stay on and let them know I won't be available? And if you can, Please reschedule them. She gestured offhandedly at a ledger clipped to the table behind her. It won't be but an hour, and then you can go home. And then she pulled herself up to her feet unsteadily. Kassandra came to her side and helped her up to the foot of the stairs, and as she turned to ascend them, the old woman's hand clamped on Kassandra's wrist. I can trust you to take care of this, can't I? Of course, Kassandra said. No trouble at all. She watched the old woman make her way up the stairs and then went to recover the tea with its cup with its remaining tea. Once she was in the working room again, Kassandra turned and faced the table. It would be very easy to sit down, but to do so would violate Madame Voss's trust. She tamped down the temptation and turned for the tea. It wasn't where she expected it. Instead, the cup sat on the same table as the ledger. Shaking her head, she grasped the cup and found it oddly cold. Something moved in the edge of her vision, and she turned quickly to find herself staring at her own image in a large mirror on the wall there. She was definitely nervous at being left alone in the working room, and it was starting to play with her nerves. Kassandra shook her head to clear her thoughts and started back to the kitchen. Tired herself, her feet shuffled along the carpet. She stared down at the teacup, trying to marshal her thoughts, and once again she felt that strange sense of being observed. But this time, when she looked back at the mirror, her image had changed. Silver covered her lips and spun in wisps down her chin. Ectoplasm. She rushed over to the mirror in fascination, and as she did so, more ectoplasm flowed from her. And only then did she look down at her feet and realize why. Static. She'd been rustling across the carpet and building up a static charge. And somehow this, like the charge of the table, had brought on an ectoplasmic discharge. The teacup in her hand forgotten, she leaned closer, and the ectoplasm didn't flow like water. It was oddly wispy, almost like spider silk. And a tickle came from her ears and nose as well as from her eyes. And when she ran a hand over her face, it clung unevenly to her fingers. And that was when she noticed the first strands flowing from her to the mirror. And as she opened her mouth, a gush of silvery filaments splashed onto the glass in front of her. Gradually, the ectoplasm spread to cover the entire surface. Webbings of light ran and shadow laced the distorted reflection. A person of panic ran through her. What had she done? How could she undo it? A finger drawn across her lip assured her that no more ectoplasm gathered there. Perhaps it was time to confess to Madame Voss, and as such she was loath to admit it. Kassandra was definitely out of her depth. She strode across the carpet, careful to lift her feet, and at the doorway she hesitated. And when she looked back to turn to the mirror, she watched in amazement as a black-clad figure swept through the opening as though it was a window. Her fingers spasmed and the teacup fell to shatter across the floor. And in that second, the specter dissolved into a mass of black mist that flowed up to the ceiling. It clung there like a roiling black thundercloud, and then shot out of the room. Kassandra followed it through the doorway. Sliding across the tiled floor, she scrambled for the staircase, seeking Madame Voss. As her foot struck the first riser, something crunched under her shoe. She grasped the banister to steady herself and felt things crackling and falling to pieces under her hand. A light brown object swung in front of her view. It caught in her hair and as it fell toward her face. She pulled it out and it came away with a halt, staring at a cicada skin, with a strand of her red hair still caught in its claws. And when she turned around, she brushed aside more and more of the casings. They covered the stairway underfoot and clung to the threads of her brown tweed dress. And as her head turned, she felt even more of them caught in her hair, spilling down her back and over her blouse. The experience was so unexpected she briefly forgot about the apparition she ran from. And that was when she heard the humming above her, echoing in the stairwell. It was a rustling sound, like leaves, but it also had a strange note to it, reminiscent of a dynamo, as it swelled and ebbed. And when they began to sing, Kassandra knew what she was facing. The reason she could not see the lights in the upper hall was because it was filled with an enormous mass of cicadas, a sheer wall of them, glistening black carapaces, flickering veined wings, and tiny red eyes. It rippled as the insects clambered over one another in a constant twitching dance. Then the center of the mass pushed outward towards her. Starting at the top of the stairs, a shape began to emerge, coalescing from the horde of cicadas. And clutching at the banister, she saw the cloaked figure from the mirror emerge from the wall of insects, its form made up of the same clicking accumulation. She was gasping now, heart racing, and as she retreated, it stepped forward, the rest of the cicadas dropping from its shoulder like an obscene cape. And then Kassandra felt her foot strike the tiled floor of the foyer. Was this the same spirit she had seen in her trip during the ectoplasm? The same one she thought was her mother? She reached down and pulled off her mother's gold ring in her right hand, holding it before her. The whirring mass of cicadas continued to block her path. It hadn't reacted to the ring. Did that mean that this wasn't her mother's shade, but rather something that mimicked her to gain Kassandra's trust? Sucking in her breath, she stepped forward, and in sync with her, the cicada shade stepped down the staircase. The shroud of insects parted to reveal its face, a mask of silver. The ectoplasm limned in fine relief, bringing out a long nose and heavy brows of a young man. She understood now. This was a test. She might have convinced Madame Voss that she was worthy of her apprenticeship, but had she convinced the spirits? The features she'd seen covered in ectoplasm snapped into place in her memory. Picture. What if it was a relative, a brother, a nephew, a son, one who had died, a spirit that would be eager to come whenever she called? Had 15 years, and the child in the picture could have well grown into the form in front of her. Jasper, Kassandra said in a taut breath. Cicadas shifted uneasily. She placed her empty hands in front of her, palms up. Kassandra said, Jasper, your mother believes that I have potential. I hope you see that as well. The mass of insects continued down the stairs, step by step, until it stood before her. And gradually the cicadas parted until the rest of the silvery form came to light underneath their bodies. Its hand reached out, and a sharp finger poked her once above her heart in a very familiar gesture. And then it walked past her, turning towards the working room. The long cape of cicadas swept the floor as it passed through the doorway, and everywhere the insects touched, the shells that littered the ground vanished in silvery bubbles. And when she was finally able to breathe, she saw a cloud of cicadas stripped away from Jasper's ethereal form, launch itself through the ectoplasm haze surface of the mirror. Jasper turned toward her and beckoned. Stealing her courage, she approached the spirit, and when she stood before him, Jasper reached out for her. Kassandra did her best not to flinch away. The silvery hands covered her face like a mask blocking out all the light. Kassandra felt a water chill like coat her skin. And then something impinged on her senses. She once again found herself looking at the strange path when she had thrust her face into the ectoplasmic sphere. She could feel Jasper beside her. His hands touched her face again, turning her. And now she could see that beyond the path were stands of white bark birch trees, rose towers, and walls of alabaster. Open doorways, porticos, and gates led into the buildings, and from everywhere came the ringing sounds of hammers, and the white dust hung in the air. She wanted to speak, but found that here she had no voice. In a reversal of fortune, it was Jasper who read her lips to answer her questions. No, you can't hear the choir. It's not for mortal ears. But what you can hear is the work. His finger lingered on her lips, drawing forth more questions. What do we do? Why do we expand the mansion within the pearly gates? There are always more dead. Some imagine the afterlife is nothing but the absolute in pleasure. How long can any given time have you truly been happy? And how long have you stayed that way? We're human. We don't know how to do that. Instead, some of us find that the truest reward is having a purpose. A purpose even like mine, protecting my mother and aiding her. Then there are as many purposes as there are the living, and the passed on. It could be even that you, Kassandra, have a purpose. That was when she felt them, the others lurking among the doorways just out of sight, waiting for her. The voices who would gladly answer when she called. She bowed her head, and then Jasper turned to her once more, pointing her back toward the light of the familiar, nudging her towards life. But before she returned, Jasper had one last comment. Your mother has a purpose as well. She has, however, realized that being close to you could draw dangerous attention. So she will be there for you, Kassandra, but it will be from a distance. And with that, Jasper pushed her back through the portal into the mortal realm. When she opened her eyes, Madame Voss stood framed in the doorway of the working room. She nodded approvingly at Cassandra. You have a lot of work ahead of you, girl. My son is a good judge of character. You will do just fine. As she turned away, she threw over her shoulder. If you listen to me, that is. And that was Beyond the Familiar, which appeared in Afterpunk, a collection of steampunk stories, as well as part of the Cassandra Leyden adventures, which make up Spirit Seeker.